Okay, everybody, welcome back to episode 10, and I hope you're having as much fun with this as I am. So now we have the question in our backdrop of Mark, and really the ministry of Jesus was the nations, or the non-Jewish, non-Israeli people who embody the rest of the world. So let's remember the calling to Abraham, or the calling of Abraham, in Genesis 12, when his calling was missional and vocational and really priestly, not exclusive, in that somehow his progeny or his descendants or his seed would be a blessing for all of the families of the earth, which means that other families that aren't his, right? So we're going to see that Judaism and Second Temple Judaism, and really the Torah and the prophets themselves and the Psalms, all had a horizon and a vision for the nations. Okay, so let's just define terms real quickly. So the Gentile, or those of the nations, means everybody and anybody who's not of the nation, the chosen people, which we know as Israel. Okay, and we'll get into a little bit more as our study continues about who Israel actually is according to the Bible. I know this is a very contested topic, and I want to assert my voice in there as well. Obviously, I'm going to use a lot of scripture, historical context, and to try to properly identify these terms. Because, for example, Charlie the Fish could use the word school that refers to his family, but Miss Nancy, the math teacher, could use school in reference to a building that she works at in her job, right? They're using the same word, but they have completely different categories and concepts for what they really are trying to say. And so when we're going to look at this, we just want to do the best we can to properly situate how these terms work together. And so we're going to see that Paul, speaking to or writing to a predominantly non-Jewish audience, i.e. the Gentiles, and he's going to say that you're not Gentiles anymore, actually, former Gentiles. So, which is kind of interesting. So we'll get into that and what that means and what that looks like, and what are the implications for that for those of us who actually said yes and really want to pursue being in Messiah. So one of the most common misunderstandings of Jesus' ministry is framing his interactions with non-Jews as a surprising departure from what we would call Jewish exclusivism, as if Judaism, or the religion of the Jews, had zero interest in the nations, and Jesus was breaking new ground by engaging them, which is not necessarily the case. And the truth and the reality is much more complicated, and it's much more textured. Great word there. So the Hebrew Bible holds multiple perspectives on the nations, and there's kind of some tension there, right? And as we move through our study, we'll get into a little bit more. We'll get a little bit more granular and talk about what's actually happening. So, for example, you have Ezra and Nehemiah with some of the returning exiles from the Judean exile under the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, the book of Daniel talks about this quite a bit. The prophet Jeremiah is involved with this dilemma quite a bit. In the history of the kings, the history of Israel, the end of the book of 2 Kings really chronicles this event as well. But Ezra and Nehemiah emphasize strict ethnic boundary maintenance for the restoration community. Now, we usually don't have a historical background or a covenantal background of what's going on and why, and there are answers to this that have nothing to do with the exclusion of the nations, but it's all about the centrality and maintaining the centrality and supremacy of Jerusalem as the locus of the covenant, and with the anticipation and hopes of David's son, or the king of Israel, being re-enthroned on from Zion. That's really what that's about, and not having that boundary or that locus move to another geographic location, which would have been Samaria in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. But we can get into that a little bit more granularly as our study progresses. We also see Ruth and Jonah insist that outsiders are fully within God's purposes. Okay, and great prophetic texts like we have in Isaiah, we have Micah, we have Zechariah, envision something remarkable. In the age to come, which we await, the nations, the goyim, the ethnos in the Greek, or the Gentiles, will stream and flow up to Zion. They will learn the Torah, actually, keep that in mind when we're trying to interpret Paul, who says he himself got his gospel from the prophets that say this, and they will worship Israel's God and share in the blessings of the covenant, which is interesting because when we read also Paul's letters as well, one of the passages when he says that you're not Gentiles anymore, you who were Gentiles who have now been brought near, who have been made to participate in the commonwealth of Israel and have become participants in the covenants, plural covenants of promise, which is interesting. This was all Paul's framework and horizon of the things that he was teaching, and which promoted the response he was looking for, catalyzing radical commitment to the God of Israel in light of the coming of his son. So these ideas weren't marginal. Isaiah 56 especially envisions foreigners who bind themselves to the God of Israel. They keep the Sabbath. They honor the Sabbath. They delight in the Sabbath. And we're not talking about any day you want. We're not talking about some abstract metaphysical category where Jesus is the Sabbath. This is nonsense. This is not exegesis. This is silly. So we're talking about a literal day on the week, which the Bible communicates is the seventh day of the week, not the first day of the week. The foreigners will honor this day. They'll delight in this day. And they'll hold fast to the covenant and be fully welcomed to participate in worship of the God of Israel among and within Israel. Their sacrifices will be accepted on the altar of God alongside all of Israel's. Isaiah 66 goes even further, speaking of the nations serving as priests and Levites. Actually, it's pretty neat. By the way, disclaimer, this is not a replacement theology idea. Israel has not been replaced. The church, the Gentiles, don't replace anybody. If we hold fast to the word of our faith, to the belief that we have and persevere, we will participate with Israel in the age to come. We will participate as Israel. Okay? The dominant prophetic vision wasn't the destruction of the nations or their absorption into a generic mankind, but it was their pilgrimage to Zion and their inclusion in covenant life participation in the age to come. So with that backdrop, Jesus's repeated movements into Gentile and quasi-Gentile territory take on a really significant difference than what they're usually given. Okay, so the healing of the Gerasene demoniac. Okay, again, I'm drawing from predominantly Mark here. This is Gentile territory east of the Jordan River. There's a bunch of prophetic imagery coming in here, just like Joshua of Moses with Israel sitting on the other side of the Jordan. He's got to go here. Okay. Interestingly, in Mark 4, quotes Isaiah 9 when it says that he's going to the Galilee of the Gentiles, and he quotes some of Israel's tribes: Zebulun, Naphtali, the land of the Gentiles. The encounter with the Syrophoenician woman was in the region of Tyre. Okay. The healings in the Decapolis, which is a predominantly Gentile region. Decapolis literally is a Greek word that means 10 cities. The feeding of the 4,000. To remember, we have the feeding of the 5,000, the feeding of the 4,000. The 4,000 was almost certainly Gentile territory, deliberately echoing the feeding of the 5,000 among the Jews. So these aren't experiments in a future Gentile mission program. They are anticipatory signs that the prophets have already foretold, with foretastes of exactly what the prophet said would happen when God's kingdom arrives. We still await that day. Okay, the nations begin to come within the orbit of Israel's God, experiencing his power and his mercy and his love in what Isaiah and Zechariah said the age of restoration would look like. Okay? So the Syrophoenician woman is the clearest example. Her persistence in her extraordinary faith, honoring the King of Israel, recognizing him and honoring him. He actually honors her. Her willingness to press through every obstacle to reach him. This is precisely the kind of orientation toward Israel's God that the prophets describe when they envision the nations coming to Zion. Okay? This lady is not an exception to the rule. She's a preview of the promise in its fullness. Okay? So there's a whole lot more to say here. Remember that the calling of Abraham and his seed was ultimately to be a light to the nations, and that all of the families of the earth would be blessed in them. And so this is the main thing. This is the dominant theme running through it all. This story undergirds the whole story, and this is the purpose and calling of Israel. Okay, so the nations are a central piece of the program, and we have a lot of implications and foreshadowing of this in the text itself, which is going to be exciting, and it's going to hopefully be a real big blessing for you guys to work through this together with me. So remember, the nations were never outside of the scope of Israel's horizon and hope. Mark in the gospel is going to show us that horizon is already beginning to open. So hope this has been a blessing for you guys. Looking forward to the next episode. Have a good day. Blessings.